Welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio, where truth equals reality, and truth is often stranger than fiction.
Hello everyone, welcome to Paranormal Palace Radio. Pardon me. This is your host, Royce the Redneck Radio Man, and joining me today is Nick Redfern. And we're going to talk about a new book of his that's been out on the market for a very short time, that I got the honor and privilege of reading this book. Very extremely informative. I really enjoyed reading it, and I think you folks will too, and I think you're going to enjoy listening to Nick tell you about it. And it's called The Pyramids in the Pentegon, and the subtitles in, well, I probably got it in bigger print on the book cover right here. The Government's Top Secret Pursuit of Mystical Relics, Ancient Astronauts, and Lost Civilizations, which this is, to my knowledge, pretty new ground to cover all of this, and from the government angle with the Ancient Astronaut and Pyramid thing, pretty new ground that Nick's covering that most people I don't think have covered yet. And they've covered it separately, but he's kind of put this together, and it's really got some information in it that was a surprise to me, and I think it'll be a surprise to y'all. Nick, how are you doing tonight?
Hey, Royce, I'm doing good, thanks. How's things?
Oh, I'm doing just great, and I hope you pardon that little frog. We got a lot of rainy weather coming down here in Houston, Texas, and it just kind of gunks up my throat till it, passes over. So I usually can hit the mute button when you're talking, but when I'm talking, it kind of catches you by surprise. So, at any rate, Nick, why don't you, as a kind of an icebreaker, kind of let people know a little something about you. What led you into this particular topic?
Well, yeah, you're right, Royce. It was one that's sort of a bit of a departure and a new angle, at least in terms of the specific angle to the ancient astronauts scenario. I mean, over the years, going back to even before, the days of Eric von Daniken with things like Chariots of the Gods, there were authors talking about the whole ancient astronaut scenario, but it was von Daniken who, sort of really 40 years or so ago, brought it into the public domain and popular culture. Then, of course, there have been people like Zecharia Sitchin with his books. And today, of course, the History Channel's Ancient Aliens, which has sort of brought it to a whole new audience. And over the years, I've written a lot of books on a lot of different subjects, but I've never really kind of tackled the whole ancient astronauts angle before. And the main reason being, there are a lot of good researchers and writers already sort of heavily involved in writing in that field, so it's like, what's the point of doing something that's going to copy somebody else? There's no point, that's one of the sort of criteria.
No point reinventing the wheel.
Yeah, it's, one of the criteria I've always sort of looked for when I'm writing books is that even if I'm working on something on an old case, you want to be able to bring something new to it. And that was, I had nothing new to say on the ancient astronauts thing until about 3 years ago, 3.5 years ago, I started just sort of collecting snippets of information on what seemed to be official interest in aspects of the whole ancient astronaut scenario. Now, somebody might have made mention in a magazine article of, just a quarter of a page or something, or somebody else mentioned something in a lecture they'd been told about, like a secret CIA investigation of some ancient mystery. And so I began collecting all this material together and began sort of delving into it further to see if these stories led anywhere or if it was just a brick wall. And surprisingly, a lot of them did lead somewhere, but they went down paths that hadn't really been sort of addressed by other researchers before. So I spent
true.
Yeah. So I spent about 18 months just digging as intensely as I could, or intensively as I could, into these cases. And then, by the time I'd done all the groundwork and then got the field work and the interviews and everything else done, there was actually enough to sort of turn it into a book. So that's why I wrote this book, and, sort of looks at a very alternative angle to, the more well-trodden ancient astronauts scenario. And so that's the idea of the book. It looks at not so much what the research community's uncovered about ancient aliens and ancient astronauts, but what elements of the military, the government, and the intelligence community have found out about it.
Right. Now, I got to tell you, I was really very impressed. I've mentioned this to you down through the years when you've been on my show before that I'm a avid researcher of the ancient astronauts myself, and I can't tell you the amount of books I've read. I've read all of Sitchin's, and I've read some of Von Daniken's, and, well, I just don't want to go down the whole long list right now, but quite a bit. And I got to tell you, the stuff you got in this here, you had some stuff I'd never heard of before, which is, you know, I wanted to bring some of this stuff out during the show. Like, for instance, I had never really realized that our government themselves had an interest in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I thought that would be as good a place as any to start, was with you maybe sharing with us a little something about exactly what is their interest.
Yeah, sure, not a problem. Well, the CIA's interest, or the government as a whole's interest in the Dead Sea Scrolls goes back to 1947, which was both the year that the Dead Sea Scrolls were found and the year in which the CIA was created. And it was the CIA that primarily was interested in the scrolls. And of course, you know, 1947 was an interesting historic year in general because it was the year of the flying saucer with the Kenneth Arnold sighting over Washington State. It was also the year of Roswell. You know, so there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in that year. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, I mean, they're called the Dead Sea Scrolls because they were found in a series of caves on the northwest side of the Dead Sea at a place called Qumran, which basically borders Jordan on one side and Israel to the other. And together today now, they amount to about 1,000 altogether, these scrolls. And they basically sort of represent the earliest kind of written documentation from the Old Testament, and they date from around about 150 to about 70 BC. And today they're on public display at a place called the Shrine of the Brook, which is like a division of the Jerusalem-based Israel Museum. You know, you can go along and see them, and they're on public display. But the story of the CIA relates to another scroll, which apparently never actually made its way to this official collection, and instead made its way into the archives of the CIA and has never been seen since, you know, which is kind of unusual if all it is just some ancient scroll, you know, relating biblical events. But the story in question basically surfaced from a guy named Miles Copeland. Miles Copeland was somebody who, during the Second World War, was already involved in sort of intelligence gathering and espionage operations with the Old Office of Strategic Services and the Central Intelligence Group, which collectively, you know, people from both those organizations were sort of drafted into the new CIA when it was created in 47. And Miles Copeland was offered a position as basically sort of the senior station officer for the CIA in Damascus, the capital of Syria. And his office was working out of the American Embassy. And one particular morning in late 1947, this kind of mysterious character, this Egyptian guy in these sort of long, flowing Bedouin-type robes, turned up at the embassy door and kind of in a mysterious, almost like a, you know, sort of clandestine fashion, said he wanted to speak to somebody in authority because he got something he wanted them to see and to decipher. And so he was transferred to Copeland, who invited him into his office and said, well, what is it you've got? And he pulled out this from his robes, this huge parchment manuscript, if you like. But it was one that was kind of interconnected. So in other words, instead of being like the pages of a book, it sort of unrolled, you know, almost like unrolling a bandage or something like that. And so just one huge sort of piece of parchment. And this Bedouin chap said, well, you know, I want it translating. I want somebody who can understand what it says. And Copeland said, quite truthfully, you know, he wasn't an expert in ancient languages, but he had a colleague and friend who was also heavily linked to the CIA, a guy named Kermit Roosevelt, who was sort of well-versed in ancient sort of Sanskrit-type languages, etc. And so he agreed to have this material sent over to Roosevelt for analysis and study. This apparently pleased the guy who brought it in, and he sort of vanished out the door, said he promised to come back, and mysteriously never did come back. So Copeland was sort of left with this parchment, which he photographed and developed the negatives, and after Roosevelt had looked at them, it was all sent to the CIA for analysis again, and And it never surfaced again. Copeland never saw the parchment, the photographs, the negatives, nothing. It just literally vanished into the heart of the CIA. And although he did get word back that it related, interestingly enough, to the book of Daniel, and reportedly a lot of stuff to do with like supernatural visions, prophecies, foretelling the future, strange prophetic dreams and things like that. And what's interesting is we know that this sort of period, the late 40s, early 50s, was when the CIA began its research, its very earliest research, into what eventually by the 1970s became known as remote viewing or psychic spying. So one of the things I sort of speculate on is that maybe this had relevance. You know, the CIA saw this ancient book which told the secrets of how to prophesize and, you know, psychically sort of dispatch the soul, if you like, from the body. And they may have been sort of inspired or learned from this, you know, and applied that to their own psychic research. And that's possibly, I think, why maybe this one scroll of all of them, you know, hasn't surfaced publicly. But the story got even weirder in the 1990s when, the 1980s and 90s, when two researchers, one named Bill Steinman, another one named Tim Cooper, who were both looking into stories of crashed UFO incidents in New Mexico back in the 40s. They were both given stories by insider sources of alleged crashed UFO incidents in New Mexico back then, where when the military reportedly gained access to these sources, they supposedly contained what looked eerily like Dead Sea Scrolls, you know, sort of ancient Sanskrit parchment-type manuscripts, and reportedly these were handed over to some of the National Security Agency's best code-breakers who were able to decipher at least some of it as like a very ancient Middle Eastern language, but other parts seemed to defy explanation, that, you know, they were just too old and sort of too ancient in terms of trying to identify what language they belonged to. So, you know, we have this story which we can verify of the CIA involvements with the Dead Sea Scrolls in 47 involving Miles Copeland, and we have this other story linking crashed UFOs and the Dead Sea Scrolls, also in 47. So that's kind of where we're at. But I think possibly, or probably, you know, at some point the story is inevitably going to get bigger, because I'm sure, you know, there's other things to come out as to, you know, how these people in the 1990s got their stories, etc. And, you know, I'm pretty sure there's going to be a lot more revelations as time goes on.
Oh, I'm quite sure there will. I know that got my attention because I had no clue that there was any connection between, you know, the Kevin Arnold sightings or the Roswell sightings and the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's the first I heard of the Hebrew Bible being found in that deal that was making that connection. And I don't think it's really, you know, widely published right now, is it?
No, I mean, Bill Steinman, who co-wrote a book called UFO Crash at Aztec, he did mention it a couple of times. And Tim Cooper published a paper that mentioned it very, very briefly, albeit not to any great extent. And, you know, some people said, well, maybe it's disinformation. But the problem is, well, which it could be, I don't dispute that, but if it is, whoever was spreading it went a very strange way of spreading it, because it was almost like a half-hearted attempt. They made no attempt to really push the story into the UFO community. You know, they gave it to two guys who didn't do much with the story, and after that it just sort of died away. You know, and unless you read Tim Cooper's or Steinman's privately published little articles, which didn't really make it online to any great extent, you wouldn't even know it. So, you know, that kind of is the exact opposite of what disinformation people do. You know, they want the story spreading because they want to spread the disinformation. So.
Exactly. I mean, it doesn't do any good to have any disinformation if there's nobody around to get deceived by it.
No, that's right. You're exactly right. So I think that's one of the reasons why I think there's more to this. And, you know, whether more comes out, that's the bigger issue. But, you know, the fact that it's sort of totally illogical in terms of how we know disinformation works, you know, there has to be some other inspiration behind it, I think so.
Oh, yeah, I would agree. Now, I'm sorry about that.
That's all right.
Since we covered 1 and 2 in one big shot there, we can move on to 3. And this one here, I think you kind of briefed on a little bit in the book, if I understood it correctly, but I'm kind of getting more confirmation here. Do you think the Vatican drew similar conclusions about the alien visitation as the NSA did, that, basically they were visiting back in, prehistory, back in the days of, say, the Israelites to the desert, and maybe even further back. You think the Vatican had the same idea as the NSA on that one after they got to see this here manuscript or whatever it was?
Well, we can speculate. The thing I would say for sure is that, the very fact that in the last decade or more, the Vatican's been far more open and vocal on, number one, that aliens may exist, number two, they may be visiting here, and number three, that they don't, the Vatican doesn't believe it sort of impacts upon their religion. And I think what all this kind of tells me is that there are people in the Vatican who suspect that, a lot of ancient texts and stories and legends of the gods coming down from the skies may actually be relative more to UFO visitations. And the very fact that the Vatican is endorsing or saying it's okay to believe in this, I think they have either a suspicion or they've been briefed to sort of prepare people for, some sort of religious shocks, if you like, or revelations, no pun intended, to the effect that, what a lot of people, millions of people believe happened may have had an entirely different point of origin. And I think it's their way to sort of slowly getting people prepared potentially for that, disclosure.
Yeah,
when I say disclosure, I don't mean like a UFO, when people talk about the government disclosure, I'm thinking more along the lines that they may actually be just thinking of finding a way to try and ease people's minds over to the idea that, religion and aliens might somehow be intertwined.
Right. You don't mean it quite in the same way, like, say, Richard Dolan and Bryce
No,
in their new book.
Yeah, I don't. I tell you for why. Because I think, I think the Vatican may well, I won't say they're working on their own, but I think the Vatican obviously as a powerful organization has its own agenda, I think, to reveal this. But although, people like Richard and Steve Bassett are doing a lot of good, solid work, to get disclosure disclosed, my only downside with this, as I see it, and it's a big downside, is that government agencies only sort of reveal information when it's to their benefit to do so. To open the floodgates to everything on the UFO subject, much of which is quite problematic and disturbing. Why would the government put itself in that place? And of course, if the government discloses, if they just hypothetically said, okay, we're going to come clean, here's all our UFO stuff. Oh, and by the way, aliens didn't really crash at Roswell, and cattle mutilations are done not by aliens, but biological warfare experiments or something. There'll be certain people in the disclosure movement who will say, well, it's not real disclosure. So in other words, unless disclosure actually says what everybody in the field wants, it won't matter because they won't believe it. Do you see what I mean? So that's why I have doubts that disclosure will happen or can actually work, because unless it adheres to what everybody believes is being hidden, they will just say, well, they haven't told us everything. It's not disclosure after all. So.
It's just partial, yeah.
Yeah, so you never satisfy everybody unless it satisfies everybody's pet theories.
Well, Richard Dolan was on my show last Tuesday, and I mentioned your book while he was on there. By the way, he speaks highly of you and your book. He
I like Richard.
He really likes it. His new book is AD After Disclosure. I'm saying that for the listeners' benefit out there, because I did plug your book on his show, so I figured it's on.
No, that's totally fine. It's a good book. I enjoy his book. It's like a theoretical look, but it covers a lot of the areas and issues that undeniably would be covered if disclosure ever happened. I'm just not sure in the real world rather than the theoretical world.
Well, even Richard, he said himself that they're going to, be like pulling teeth to get everything out of them. Well, actually, that wasn't quite what he said, but, that's a general idea. Same thing you're saying, that they'll never want to, get up off anything, much less everything.
Well, again, the thing is, it's like if it happens, that's the thing. I don't understand, because, there are a lot of disturbing aspects to it. Why the government would put itself as almost like it's a fall guy, where they have to then explain, number one, why they've hidden it. And if they're going to disclose everything, why give themselves such a headache? I want them to reveal the information, but from their perspective, why would they give themselves such a headache of revealing the really disturbing stuff as well as, just the amazing stuff. What's their benefit to do that? That's what I don't see.
Right. And, like we were saying, they either going to have a reason to, in the form of gain, or, like I was saying a minute ago, they ain't got no choice whatsoever in the matter. Without motivation, why do anything? Why nobody does anything, from anything small to big without motivation that I know of.
And of course, there's one big thing that a lot of people forget. If the government discloses and claims they've got this and they've got that and they have proof, unless they put it all on public display, it's like, well, how are they going to prove it? Because, ironically, the aliens themselves, or whatever they are, interdimensional or who knows what, whatever the phenomenon is, that's hiding itself as well. That's why the government cover-up works so well, because the phenomenon itself is not practicing disclosure, So it's kind of like, if the government says, well, we found evidence of this and we believe this is going on, and, at the end of the day, it's just their word, because we haven't got, aliens hovering over a major city every night, So.
Right. Now, back to question 3 about that Vatican. I was going to make mention before I left that altogether that, I noticed that in the Old Testament, if you go back and read it, almost every god in there is said to be a god of wood, and many of the names that's in there that are said to be gods of wood are described in Egypt and Sumer as flesh and blood gods that were interreacting. So that kind of makes me think that perhaps, if not the Vatican, but long before them, the ancient Jews wasn't trying to already erase any knowledge of these ET long before the days of Jesus, in other words.
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing is, when you look at a lot of ancient religious texts, that a lot of them have been translated and translated and translated. Certain of them we know, some of the stories are passed down orally before there was even writing. Different religions have very similar stories. It's like the biblical story of the flood, where, Noah lands on Mount Ararat, is almost identical to the story of Gilgamesh, aside from the fact it's totally different people in a totally different part of the world. So in other words, lots of different religions have strands of exactly the same stories, and they put their own interpretations on it, and more importantly, they've denied the spin that another religion puts on it, and they've deleted this part of the story or that part. And I think, you can go back and find clear evidence where this has been done, where selective processing basically has been done to weed out those parts that seem problematic. And that's
make the story unique to their culture, even though it had a common origin.
But by doing that, who knows what sort of data's been destroyed.
Oh, yeah.
We'll probably never know now, but
destroyed or confused.
Destroyed or confused, or a bit of both. And, so one religion says, well, we're right because this happened and, our book's right. And somebody else says, no, our book's right. That's the problem. That's why there's so much war, because everybody insists their version is literally correct and everybody else is literally wrong, so.
Well, that's funny you should mention Noah's Ark at that point, because that's the next question I was going to ask you about, because this is something else that's news to me. I know there's been a lot of people claim to find Noah's Ark, and I've even heard of Hitler looking for it, or was it Himmler, or both? But
well, it was Himmler, but under the auspices of Hitler. Himmler was somebody who was fascinated by ancient relics, and Hitler, as the overall boss of the Nazis, he basically funded these quests to find ancient relics, that could be weaponized or whatever.
But the part that was news to me was our government having interest in it. And I was going to ask you, in your opinion, why do you suppose our government would have an interest in an old boat parked on top of a huge mountain?
Well, the main thing I would say is because evidently it's not just an old boat.
I mean, it could have to be something more, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, if this thing that actually within the Pentegon and within the CIA, they don't call it Noah's Ark. They refer to it as the Ararat anomaly. That's what it's officially known as. In the same way that UFOs for the government are officially known as UFOs, unidentified flying objects. This thing is known as the Ararat anomaly. And you're quite right that, if it was just sort of an old, for want of a better term, a fossilized old ship, that would be something of interest for students of the Bible, archaeologists, historians, people like that. Not, the top brass of the CIA. And yet, that's exactly what we see happening. And I was actually very pleased to get through the Freedom of Information Act, something like 70 or 80 pages altogether.
Wow.
Of documentation on the Ararat anomaly, a fair bit of which, as you'll know, I reproduce in the book. And basically the story goes back to 1949, when a US Air Force spy plane was flying across Turkey towards the border with the Soviet Union. The reason being that there were stories circulating through intelligence channels that the Soviets were building a new military base very near the border of Turkey. And of course, with Turkey being our friends, that was kind of similar to the scenario later on, with the Russians wanting to put missiles in Cuba, right on America's doorstep. It was kind of seen like that, it was too close a threat from a national security perspective. So this plane, which was actually not like a high-flying fighter spy plane, it was like a large lumbering propeller-driven bomber. The intention was to get as close to the base as they could and photograph it with like high-powered lenses, etc. But one of the things they had to do to get to the area where they were flying to was actually go very, very close to Mount Ararat, and they used that as a guidance point. And of course, Mount Ararat is where, according to the Christian Bible, Noah's Ark came to rest. And as they got very close to the top of the mountain, which is like 17,000 feet high, and it's pretty much, just covered for the top 3,000 or 4,000 feet in just thick ice and snow sheets all year round, pretty much. As they got close to the top of the mountain, one of the guys on the plane said he could see what looked like a huge wing-like structure sticking out the snow and ice, which looked to be about 600 feet long. So they swung the plane around to photograph it, got permission to do so. As they were turning the plane, one of the other guys on the other side of the plane said he could see a very similar-looking structure on an adjacent slope. So when they finished filming the first one, they swung around again and photographed the second one, which again was also described as like a 600-foot-long wing, as if something had smashed into the mountain and split into two sections. Now, of course, if these were wings of some sort of aerial vehicle, they would have had an overall width of 1,200 feet. Never mind back then, nobody today is flying an aircraft with a wingspan of 1,200 feet. It would never, not only would it not get off the ground, but at any airport in the US, it would be knocking towers and fences over and buildings left, right and centre, because there just wouldn't be room for it to get off the ground or turn around. And yet that's what they described. So then they continued on with the original mission, returned back to the base, which was in Europe, got the pictures developed, and they were sent over to the Pentagon, shared with the CIA, and then vanished for years, although a couple of them have surfaced through the Freedom of Information Act and actually reproduced one of these pictures in the book, which does show like a dark-coloured object on the mountain. Now, over the years, the CIA, the Air Force, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and a couple of other departments have all taken an interest in what this thing might be. Now, as I said, if it was just a wooden old boat, that's not something to sort of occupy the finest minds of the CIA for 50 years or more, or actually now more than 60 years. But nevertheless, it did. And two things kind of stand out. One is that the FBI were heavily watching a number of people who I mentioned in the book, who had been talking about the Ark in terms of government secrecy, or who were perceiving it to be like a crashed UFO rather than, a wooden old boat. Now, one of these was one of the early contactees named George Van Tassel. George Van Tassel was sort of very much a precursor to people like von Daniken and Sitchin. Even in the late 50s, he was talking about the whole ancient astronaut scenario and believing that, the whole sort of immaculate conception thing was due to like genetic alien intervention and tinkering, if you like. He believed that Adam and Eve were not sort of a man and a woman, but a race of beings that it became mythologized, if you like, as two entities or two people. And he also believed that Noah's Ark was basically like a huge space ark built by aliens. His conclusion was that aliens visited the Earth in the distant past, and did so on many occasions, but on one occasion it was when they realized that, Earth was about to go through some huge cataclysmic change, namely a worldwide flood that was likely to kill off, whole massive percentages of the population of pretty much everything. The planet would be sort of re-sculpted, if you like, because of these floods and the polar tilt, he claimed as well. And his view was that one of these huge space arcs, rather than sort of a wooden arc, actually had on board, sort of countless examples of human life and animal life on the planet, which, after all the waters had settled again, could be used to sort of restart the populations and, kickstart life back on the planet again. And the FBI watched Van Tassel very, very closely for years for these specific statements and particular claims he was making. Recorded all this material sort of, copiously in their files. So that was the one angle the government was looking at. The other one was, and this demonstrates the sheer extent to which the CIA was secretly watching people in relation to Noah's Ark. Just by coincidence, in 1975, several books were all published by different authors, all on their own searches for Noah's Ark. It was just purely, just down to random. They all came out in the same year. One of them was written by a man named Fernand Navarro, and he'd spent actually time on Mount Ararat and found various pieces of wood that he felt, were old enough where they could have been conceivably something, connected with an ark. What was interesting is that the files I got through the Freedom of Information Act show that in 75, when Navarro was promoting his book at a shopping mall in Washington, D.C., the CIA actually sent out personnel to sort of clandestinely sit in the audience and listen to what he was talking about. And the documents actually mention how the CIA hoped that by listening to what Navarro had to say, it would help them solve the ark problem. And that term, the ark problem, is how the CIA refer to it in their files. And of course that begs the question, what is it about an old boat on a mountain thousands of years ago that's a problem to the CIA? That's one of the big intriguing questions that with a lot of these things, unfortunately, we end up with some good answers and information, but we end up with a lot of questions as well, and that's one of them.
Yeah, why is it when you get answers, you always get questions to go with them?
Yeah, it's inevitable in this subject.
But before we forget, because I think I already did, if y'all want to learn more about Nick Redfern, you can go to www.nickredfern.com, and he posts his shows and all his new information he has coming up there. Also, y'all can probably get links to his books there. You can call in if you want to ask questions at 832-632-7904. And if you scroll down below the chat room and the call-in number, you'll see the show's description. And at the bottom of that description, you'll see I have a link to his book over to the Amazon where you can buy it direct from them, which I get a commission off of that if you do, by the way, if you don't mind my plug. And, I'm going to be moving this here show description tomorrow or the next day to my archive. And I'm going to be putting this up in a video format with Nick's picture and book cover and my picture and a DVD, or not that, but a WMV, and with the show's, sound quality. And I'm going to upload it to this site here, my site, and the archive. I'm going to upload it to YouTube and Media Cafe and Daily Motion for future posterity. And y'all can invite your friends to see it at any of these places. And Nick, as usual, I'll be sending you the links to that as soon as I get them up.
All right, cool.
Sometimes I get distracted and I get a little behind, but I'm usually
don't worry about
catching up. But coming back to the topic at hand, in the book, I was going to also, because I noticed that you had a very, very informative description of the pyramids on page 68 that I thought was very in-depth and also very revealing about the pyramids being in excess of 450 feet and 75 feet long. You're talking about a mass of 6 million tons worth of stone there, being quarried 500 miles. Now, what you didn't put in this book, but I'm pretty sure you probably read somewhere, I know I have, is that according to Zawi Hawass, I think it is, his claim is that this pyramid was built in 20 years, I think it was, and it's been said that it takes about 20 men or more, I think it was, or was it 100 men, at least 2 minutes to move, would have to move one block every 2 minutes and, you know, get it in place and all of that. How do you move blocks 500 miles with logs and ropes and go 450 feet up in the air with, you know...
Well, with great difficulty, that's how you do it. But, yeah, I mean, you know, that's the whole sort of conventional scenario, you know, that it's done with rollers, ropes, brute force manpower, pulleys, etc. But, you know, that still really doesn't explain how you get a multi-ton stone, you know, X number of 100 feet in the air. It just doesn't, you know. I'd be more satisfied if somebody actually funded a program to build a pyramid the size of the Great Pyramid the way they claim it was done. You know, granted, it's going to take a lot of money and whatever to do it, but just to see the feasibility of it actually done, you know. And it's like with Stonehenge in Britain, where I'm originally from. You know, Stonehenge actually isn't that big, you know, in terms of its size and scale. But even so, you know, you have some of the stones that weigh, you know, in excess of 25, 30 tons, and they're sort of sitting on top of two other stones, you know, sort of like 22, 23 feet in the air. Well, many of those stones we know have been moved miles and miles, you know, 20, 30, maybe even more than 100 miles in some cases. And, you know, and they're saying, well, they just pulled it along the ground, you know, rollers and ropes. But the thing is, it's not like the British countryside is like as flat as you know, the highway. You're talking about hills, valleys, you know, all sorts of things. And again, the idea that, you know, if you're just on a flat surface and it's nicely tarmacked, well, that's much easier. But, you know, not when you're sort of scaling hills and, you know, all the rain you get in England turn into mud and whatever. It's just not feasible, you know, to move multi-ton stones over 100 miles, you know, and do it successfully, like as if you're pushing, you know, like a bowling ball down the bowling alley or whatever. You know, it's just ridiculous.
Well, I know I, for one, I'd go looking for a job that paid a little less, that had a little less work.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, yeah, it's just crazy to imagine that, you know, you've also got the issue of, you know, how many times there'll be mistakes or, you know, just unforeseen circumstances. You know, a pole breaks, a pulley breaks, you know, it's muddy or it's sandy and, you know, the rollers fall into the sand or whatever and then you can't move the stone, you know. Are we expected to believe that not only every stone was moved in X number of time, but there was never those mistakes happening, you know? That's just craziness.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I had a friend right here in Houston. I went over to his house one time and he asked me if I'd do him a favor because I'm a big, you know, strong guy myself, and help him move his aluminum wood shed across the street to his yard because he had it on a vacant lot across the street, and it was a long walk to put stuff in it. And, I mean, you're talking about one of these, 10 by 10 little aluminum jobs? I mean, not a big, massively heavy, you know, structure, in other words. And we had 2 metal poles under it and 4 people carrying an end of the pole apiece. And even that, before I could get across the street, one of these metal poles bit and snapped right in the middle. We had to get another for that little thing. So imagine wooden logs for 25 to 80 ton stones.
Yeah, the pharaohs wouldn't be too happy with you, Royce, I don't think so.
No, I don't think they would.
A bit like, off with his head.
I'm lucky that wasn't a pharaoh.
Yeah, exactly. Good job you were born in the, you know, the 20th century, not 4,000 years ago. So. But yeah, I mean, you know, people say, well, if it wasn't, you know, just sort of brute force poles and manpower, etc., you know, how was it done? And, you know, you can look back into all these cultures, whether it's ancient Egypt, Britain with Stonehenge, Mexico, Central America, South America, you know, the Inca, the Maya, etc., ancient Greece, ancient Rome. They all had these stories about the stones. When you look at their ancient legend, you know, they're not talking about rollers or ropes. They talk about the stones being sort of magically lifted into the air and just sort of gently pushed and prodded into place. As if you might kind of, push and prod a balloon, like a party balloon. It floats in the air and you just kind of push it and then it sinks down, onto the ground or whatever. And all these different cultures, which can be separated, by centuries and thousands of miles, that they all tell pretty much the same story. And when you first kind of describe it, it sounds a little bit odd, but I'll explain what it means and why it actually is odd. But basically, all these cultures talk about these massive stones being moved either by sound, to the sound of musical instruments, or to like magical music. That's how they describe it. What they're actually talking about, it sounds like, is something today that we call acoustic levitation. And acoustic levitation is still very much in its infancy. But it's a bit complicated, but in simple terms, it's where you have what are called two opposing sound frequencies with interfering sound waves. And these opposing frequencies create between them what's called a resonance zone. And if you manipulate those frequencies, you can actually raise small objects within those resonance zones. And the military's been researching this for a number of years, actually military agencies of a number of countries, and had some degree of success with raising small objects, and some not quite so small, in these resonance zones. So my personal belief is that the ancients, wherever they got it from, whether it was from aliens or some long vanished, super race on Earth, from Earth, that destroyed themselves, who knows, maybe they inherited the technology and didn't even know where it came from. But what it sounds like they're describing is somebody in the very ancient past having access to what today we call acoustic technology. And of course, in the exact opposite fashion of, raising these stones, you think of, for example, there's a very famous story from a certain city in the Bible, how, the walls are brought down, but to the sound of trumpets, from Jericho. That sounds like this technology used in an offensive way rather than a construction fashion. Reportedly the walls are destroyed to the sound of a trumpet. Well, again, that sounds like a directed sound acoustic energy weapon directed at a wall, bring it down with sound. I mean, it's like if you go to a rock concert and you stand in front of a speaker, you feel that thump, in your chest or your head or whatever. You imagine a directed sound acoustic energy weapon directed at a wall, or if you could use these resonance zones and actually lift stones within them, that's what it sounds like. And it's like with Stonehenge, there's a legend there that Merlin, the magician who supposedly, worked under King Arthur, he supposedly moved the stones of Stonehenge to magical music. There are stories about ancient wizards and, magicians raising the stones by whistling at them. These are clearly all distorted stories passed down very often orally from generation to generation. And obviously they get distorted, but they all have at their core massive stones moved into the air and floated along by what sounds like, acoustic levitation. And I think personally there's enough evidence to suggest that is the case. One of the reasons being that, I talk about in the book, back in the 50s, a guy named Maurice Jessup, who was an early researcher of ancient astronauts and wrote a book in the 50s called The Case of the UFO. He was somebody who spent a lot of time out in the field doing research. He was fascinated by the pyramids and ancient structures and spent a lot of time in Mexico, Central America, South America, and came back convinced that these huge formations and constructions could only have been built with the benefit of something like levitation or anti-gravity. And what was interesting is that the US Navy took a deep interest in Jessup's findings and heavily and deeply interviewed him. And what's even more interesting is the people who interviewed him were from a naval special projects program. So I think there's a clear inference, that the Navy was looking into these mysteries of the past, realizing that there was some technology involved and trying to understand that and then apply it to the present, if you like.
That makes a lot of sense because I think it was like Edward Leekman on Coral Castle says he learned the secret and he had a whole book out on magnetics and that.
Yeah.
The problem with it was so complex nobody could understand it.
Well, Coral Castle is a very interesting story. It's sort of, it's like with the pyramids, it's sort of shrouded in secrecy and confusion and controversy as to how he moved these vast stones, for Carl Castle. However he did it, hardly anybody, even those who know him, seem to know how it was done. There are also stories about Tibetan monks, as I point out in the book, supposedly being able to move massive stones to the beating of a magical drum. And
Yes.
there's stories about the Russians trying to find where the Tibetan monks had hidden this technology. So in the same way that the US Navy was on Maurice Jessup's tail, it sounds like the KGB or the Russian military was on the tail of these, or the trail of these Tibetan monks to find out what they knew about this, and possibly, the Russians were trying to weaponize it in some fashion as well.
Yeah, and there's a lady named Judy Woods has a book out about what she thinks really happened at the World Trade Center. And, she doesn't come out and say it, but she does indicate that she suspects a sound device was used to bring down the World Trade Center. But I'm not saying you can't use one, and the technology could have been invented by a military somewhere, but that would have had to have been one huge, powerful weapon, wouldn't you think?
Well, yeah, as far as we know that acoustic levitation research has been done, and we know some results have been achieved, but I'll be the first to admit that what we know publicly usually is still 20 years or so behind 15 years what the government tells us. It's kind of like when the stealth bomber and the stealth fighter were rolled out in 1989. We know now the first prototypes have been test flown in the late 70s, sort of 12, 13 years before. So, what we see publicly isn't necessarily all that exists. But, as I said, a classic example of how sound, can be destructive. This is just in a very simple fashion. It's kind of like if you run your finger around a wine glass, you can get it to a frequency where the glass will shatter. That's an example in a different way, granted, but it is an example of how sound can have the same effect as hitting the wine glass, with a hammer or whatever.
Or
it's
like using high C.
Yeah, it's exactly the same thing, but in this case, the frequency is used to destroy something. Is there that much difference between a trumpet bringing down the walls of Jericho, your finger, the sound, the frequency destroying a wine glass, and a directed sound acoustic weapon bringing down a wall? It's all different aspects of finding ways to manipulate and utilize sound.
Yeah, I think it probably, and this is just a theory on my part, got a lot to do with the vibration that's accompanies sound. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, some sounds. One thing the government has researched is the idea of using acoustics as crowd control for riots. There are weapons which military agencies, and actually the Russians have actually achieved the most success in this. It's where you create weapons that sort of operate at a certain frequency, and they can sort of provoke nausea, dizziness, sickness, disable your nervous system. There's these so-called non-lethal weapons.
That.
Yeah, where somebody, you imagine you're demonstrating or something, and suddenly you feel sick and the person next to you throws up and the next one on the other side gets vertigo. They're all sort of part and parcel of the same thing, directed energy weapons to sort of disable a person's nervous system. And, this isn't sci-fi, this is a real technology. Sound can play a major effect on, a person's well-being.
Oh, yeah, without a doubt. Now, also in the book, you mentioned the sound effects built into the El Castello pyramid. I was just wondering, do you think this is a common feature in most, if not all, pyramids? Not that exact sound feature, but one form of a sound feature or another.
Yeah, it's not just the pyramids either, Royce. You can go back to some of the burial areas in Britain, where they built these sort of sacred tombs, to ancient kings and that kind of thing. They all seem to sort of resonate, and they have, when I say that acoustic technology or acoustic issues attached to them, I don't necessarily mean, like with this one now, from the perspective of levitation playing a role, but from the perspective that the ancients sort of revered sounds, noises, and acoustics. And so, you can even take the acoustic levitation angle out of the equation, and you can find countless places that were built, so they were like echo chambers. So somebody inside them, the voices would be amplified to an extraordinary degree, or sounds would even be altered to make it, like the sound of somebody's footsteps would actually sound like raindrops or something like that. It was like they had a built-in innate fascination with sound, which I think has got to tell us something significant in somewhere, I think.
Well, even the Bible itself in the book of John says, in the beginning was the Word.
There you go, yeah.
So maybe there was a message. Now, of course, I think I've been told that in that passage the word meant logos, but is there a connection between logos and actual vibration from sound, like a thought vibration, for example?
No, that's a good point. I never thought of that.
So, also I was going to ask you, in your opinion, if gravity can and has been controlled, do you think this shows the concept of weight to be an illusion?
Well, I'm not sure if it means weight's an illusion. I think it's more likely finding ways to overcome it. It's like, the principles involved, it's like, are you actually taking the weight of the object away, or are you sort of, breaking it free from its ties to gravity? That's the thing. It's like if you drop a stone out of your hand, it hits the floor because the gravity is pulling it to the ground. It doesn't actually fall to the ground because the ground's below you. It's because the gravity is pulling it that way. If you're in space and from your perspective, you're upright, if you drop a stone, it's not going to just suddenly keep plummeting below you. It's going to go not necessarily anywhere. It's just going to sort of float, unless you actually throw it. And then, that's a very different thing. So in other words, I'm not sure if it means sort of weight or mass or whatever, is an illusion. It's actually, I think, more probably along the lines of overcoming it and, finding a way to maneuver things where you actually sort of shield them almost from gravity.
Yeah, I really think that there is a way that you can have a technology that can really move big things like cars, even buildings or big blocks. It's just that we haven't got it in our modern age, at least that we know of. And I think it's very possible that the ancients had it. And I'll be honest with you, it wouldn't make sense to me if E.T. came from Orion somewhere, maybe the Dog Star, landed here and used ropes or even flying machines to move some of these big blocks all those miles. Mm-hmm. To me, the only thing, even for E.T., that would have made a lot of sense would have been some form of anti-gravity at some point in the job. Yeah.
No, you're right. I think, and the thing is, it's like the more we look into this, the more we kind of see this, this picture building up. So I think, we have to sort of treat it seriously.
Yeah, and, another thing about it is sound can be a friend or it can be an enemy. It's just like fire, a gun, or anything else. I mean...
Yeah, exactly.
Like you said, you point a sound device at you, it can knock you flat on your booty, or at the same time, it can take the weight off of something so you can pick it up.
Yeah, you're right, exactly. It's like any of these sort of things, like any technology, it can be used for good or bad purposes, so...
Okay, now, I was also got one more on here for you. There was another one, but you kind of got to that one with another one earlier, which was, do you think the ancients understood how to control gravity? But we already talked about that. In the book, you talk about incredible flying machines called Vimanas, and I might have pronounced that wrong. They were similar to our fighter jets, I believe you said in your book. How does academia account for these while denying the ancient alien theory?
Well, I mean, for me at least, this is one of the sort of the more profound, stories of, there's a lot of sort of weird stuff going on, but for me this is, one of the really weird ones. This basically goes back, or actually I should say it ties in with none other than Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, the brains, behind the atomic bomb. But it deals with something called the Mahabharata, which is this ancient Indian Sanskrit text, which nobody's really sure how far it goes back. Some researchers have suggested 8,000 years, which is still, a long time. Others have suggested it could be even older than that. It goes back tens of thousands of years based on an even more ancient text that tells an even older story of an even older culture that, we know nothing about. But, you would imagine, and it basically deals with a war called the Kurukshetra War in the Indian state of Haryana, which is in the northern part of India. And you would imagine, whether 8,000 years or 40,000 years ago, any sort of war between two rival armies, two rival factions would be fought, with chariots, horses, spears, bows and arrows, shields, swords, etc. But the Mahabharata talks about the war actually being fought with what are called vimanas, which are described as like, in the translated version, they're described as like fast-flying, super high-flying aircraft that sound just like Top Gun type aircraft, reportedly fueled by mercury, and that when they take to the skies at fantastic speed, this sort of flame bursts forth from them. They sound just like aircraft, and they unleash these mighty iron rods that, destroy cities and flatten the landscape for miles, and you have these huge plumes of smoke that hang in the air for days like a huge cloud, and then in the immediate aftermath, the hours and days, the soldiers start to fall sick and die. All of this sounds eerily like an aerial warfare resulting in nuclear attacks on other forces, and the descriptions of the atomic flash, the huge mushroom cloud, and the radiation poisoning angle of, the troops falling sick, or then the people who survive the blast, falling sick days and weeks later. And the fact that it's a verifiable, old book, is one of the sort of incredible issues that, is hard to believe, but is undeniable because it's true. And one of the more intriguing things, getting back to Oppenheimer, he was absolutely obsessed with the Mahabharata and a similar ancient text called the Ramayana. And he always took to quoting from them. He actually came to regret the day that he developed the atomic bomb, which was one of the reasons he lost his top secret clearance, because, the government was worried that he was sort of backtracking on the research or whatever. But in the early 1950s, he was speaking at a seminar in D.C., and somebody there asked him, said, were the atomic bombs the first ones we detonated? Were they the first ones? And this was in reference to the first test device, which was exploded at a place called the Trinity site in New Mexico, and then the two dropped on Japan that ended the Second World War. And he was asked, were they the first ones? And Oppenheimer said, yes, they were. And then he paused and added, in modern times, as if to say, well, yeah, they were the first ones we exploded, but we weren't necessarily the first ones to actually explode atomic bombs. We're just, in modern times, we're the first ones to do it. So, there seems to be strong influences from his work that, he was basically trying to say something that he'd learned in terms of his secret background, if you like, as in relation to maybe ancient civilizations that had come long before we did and, destroyed themselves, and all we have today is sort of folkloric tales left, etc.
Too bad we don't learn from it. We wouldn't want to destroy ourselves.
Well, who's to say, 40,000 years from now, there won't be an equivalent of me and you having a conversation about our civilization, and people say, oh, it's just nonsense, we're the first,
It might be us in a reincarnation, too.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, no, you and me may have had this here meeting before. But I've noticed that we got like 2 minutes left, so real quick, Nick, is there anything you have coming up you want to let everybody know about?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if people want to contact me, they can do so at Facebook. You can reach me at Facebook. I also have a blog which I update daily. Nick Redfern 14.blogspot.com. And I'm speaking in October, actually, on this book, The Pyramids in the Pentegon, at a conference called the Paradigm Symposium in Minneapolis. And if you Google Paradigm Symposium, visit Minneapolis, you'll get all the details of the conference, the location, hotel where it's at, and all the speakers. Which actually includes Eric von Daniken. He'll be one of the speakers there as well, so it should be a good event.
Sounds like it. I'm surprised I hadn't heard about that yet. I usually have wind of everything in advance. Maybe I'm slipping in my old age.
Well, it's there anyway. So if you check it out, Paradigm Symposium, you'll find it. So.
Okay. Well, Nick, I got to tell you, as usual, it's been a pleasure. But let me remind everybody that Nick's website is www.nickredfern.com, and you can get links to his books. And I'm pretty sure you got him on Facebook as well, right?
Yeah, people just type my name into Facebook, always pleased to chat and answer questions. People want to friend me or whatever, just send me a friend request or whatever, and I'll be, pleased to.
Trust me, I will now that I know you're there.
Okay.
But at any rate, if y'all want to learn more about him, go to Facebook, go to his website. You could get his books at any Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You can get them at my site from the archive, linked right underneath his description at his show. I really advise anybody that wants to know more to get the books. He's got this information straight from sources like FOIA. He's done the actual legwork to research this and get this information. And there's only one other person I can think of, or two other people I can think of that I know of that goes to this kind of trouble to get this kind of information, and that's John Greenwald and Richard Dolan. Nick, you probably know more people that do it than I do, but those two come to mind.
I would say that John is probably at the top of the list, in terms of, being sort of a master of the Freedom of Information Act. He's somebody who, I think he's like 30 now. He's been doing it since he was like 14 or 15 or something, but he's been, I don't even know how many files. I wouldn't even begin to imagine, how many things he's requested over the years. But I think, if you go to his site, the Black Vault, it's just jammed with, FOIA material and whatever. So.
Right. And it really is. And Dennis Balfaxer,
it's all good stuff as well,
did an article on him recently because he has a lot of promise, John does.
Yeah.
But I don't want to hold you up, Nick. It's always a pleasure to have you here. And as you know from an email we did the other day, I'm aware of a new book you have coming out, and I'm going to send you an email in the near future about coming back for that book after I've had a chance to read it, because I'm still about 5 books behind.
That's all right. Whenever you want to. That's called The World's Weirdest Places, and that's the official release date's about a month from now, something like that. So.
All righty. Well, I hope you enjoy what's left of your week and your weekend. I'm going to make it a point to look you up on Facebook probably tomorrow. I'm fixing to go meet my wife now, and I will be in touch with you in the future. And thank you very much. I've really enjoyed having you as usual.
Well, thanks for having me on the show, Royce.
Okay, you have a good one.
See you later. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, everybody. Real quick I've got a show coming up this Saturday on a Miss Lisa Beretta, and it's called The Book of Transformation, and she's going to talk to us about that in some length. And I haven't actually got to read the book yet, to be honest with you, but I'm pretty sure that the show should be of interest, and I'm pretty sure she can tell us why the book is interesting. I'm going to go ahead and cut loose for tonight, as I've got some things going on, but I want to remind everybody to, invite your friends and recommend me to people, share me in groups, share me on Facebook. It's you people that make the show go around, and I couldn't have a show without you any more than I could without my guests, so I want to thank you guys. Don't forget to visit my friends and World UFO Today and UnitedParanormalInternational.ning. The other two are temporarily, one's been down longer than the other, but I was going to say temporarily down. Don't forget to visit the radio show hosts on my radio favorites, Gary Brown at UKPN Radio, JimHarold.com, The Grelian Report with Micah Hanks, and Ohio Exopolitics of Mark Snyder. And I'm going to call that one a wrap. Everybody have a good week, what's left of the week, and I hope to see y'all this coming Saturday at 1 o'clock Central Standard Time for Lisa Beretta. Thank you very much. Y'all have a good night.